Hello, hello. It is 12:22, and I am going to read a little bit more from The Great Gatsby. It is my mission to read this entire book from cover to cover. I'm only doing it 5 pages at a time. I've been offline for a few days just because the internship that I've been doing has just kicked into some serious overdrive, so it's been very busy. I haven't read since we started really getting heavy duty into the bungler, have I? I need to remember how important it is to read every day and how important it is to work on becoming more camera friendly and all that sort of business. And the only way I'm going to do it is by reading every day and working on becoming more comfortable in front of the camera. So, anyway, we're starting on page. Where did I leave off? Page 52. It is at the party of Jay Gatsby, the very first party that Nick Carraway is attending, and Jordan Baker is there, and a whole bunch of cast of characters, as you can imagine. Some of the most beautiful wording in this entire book is happening during this party. I mean, there's lots of beautiful wording, but man, the way F. Scott Fitzgerald describes this party is the party to end all parties. And I think I was telling you the most remarkable party I've ever gone to that is, of this sort of opulence and pageantry was at my when I was at the Naval Academy, and we were guests of the superintendent, and all the blue bunting and all the manicured grounds and the huge palace this man had for a house, and just it was such a remarkable time. It's absolutely surreal, and there's a jazz trio playing music, and there's about 100, maybe 200 of us, and we all fit very easily into this man's garden. And as I told you, it was well manicured, and the smell of lilac, wisteria, and roses was just so pungent. And they had just cut the grass; you could smell the grass, and there was an area where they had just mulched, and you could smell the dirt and the manure, and all of it was just such a romantic experience. Well, that's what I go traveling back whenever I'm reading this little party sequence, and it's a big. I mean, it's actually a fair amount of the book that F. Scott Fitzgerald uses up in talking about this party. He really wanted to emphasize the opulence, the majesty, the pageantry of what was going on in this party, plus this little gem of getting to meet Gatsby for the first time. It's a remarkable part of the book. For me, maybe the most. So he had just introduced himself to Nick Carraway as Gatsby. So I'll go back a little bit and continue on for that. This is Jay Gatsby talking. I was in the 7th Infantry until June 1918. I knew I had seen you somewhere before. We talked for a minute about some wet, gray little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore along the Sound. What time? Any time that suits you best. It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. Having a gay time now? She inquired. Much better. I turned again to my new acquaintance. This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there. I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance, and this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation. For a moment, he looked at me as if he failed to understand. I'm Gatsby, he said suddenly. What? I exclaimed. Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host. He smiled understandingly. Much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with the quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may have come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would have liked to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hoped to convey. Precisely at that point it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Some time before he introduced himself, I'd got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care. Almost at the moment when Mr. Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with the information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. He excused himself with a small bow that included each of us in turn. "If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport," he urged me. "Excuse me, I'll rejoin you later." When he was gone, I turned immediately to Jordan, constrained to assure her of my surprise. I had expected that Mr. Gatsby would be a florid and corpulent person in his middle years. "Who is he?" I demanded. "Do you know?" "He's just a man named Gatsby." "Where is he from, I mean, or what does he do?" "Now you're started on the subject," she answered with a wan smile. "Well, he told me once he was an Oxford man." A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark it faded away. "However, I don't believe it." "Why not?" "I don't know," she insisted. I just don't think he went there." Something in her tone reminded me of the other girl's "I think he killed a man," and had the effect of stimulating my curiosity. I would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana or from the lower east side of New York. That was comprehensible. But young men didn't, at least in my provincial inexperience, I believe they didn't, drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. "Anyway, he gives large parties," said Jordan, changing the subject with an urban distaste for the concrete. "And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy." There was a loud boom of a bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the echolalia of the garden. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried, "at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we are going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tolstoy's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May. If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation." He smiled with jovial condescension and added, "Some sensation," whereabout everybody laughed. "The piece is known," he concluded lustily, "as Vladimir Tolstoy's Jazz History of the World." The nature of Mr. Tolstoy's composition eluded me, because just as it began my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. His tan skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. I could see nothing sinister about him. I wondered if the fact that he was not drinking helped to set him off from his guests, for it seemed to me that he grew more correct as the fraternal hilarity increased. When the Jazz History of the World was over, girls were putting their heads on men's shoulders in a puppyish, convivial way. Girls were swooning backwards playfully into men's arms, even into groups, knowing that someone would arrest their falls. No one swooned backwards on Gatsby, and no French bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quartets were formed with Gatsby's head for one link. "I beg your pardon." Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing behind us. "Miss Baker," he inquired, "I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone." "With me?" she exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, madame." She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in astonishment, and followed the butler toward the house. I noticed that she wore her evening dress, all her dresses, like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness about her movement, as if she had learned first to walk upon golf courses on a clean, crisp morning. I was alone, and it was almost 2. For some time, confused and intriguing sounds had issued from a long, many-windowed room which overhung the terrace. Eluding Jordan's undergraduate, who was now engaged in an obstetrical conversation with 2 chorus girls, and who implored me to join him, I went inside. The large room was full of people. One of the girls in yellow was playing the piano, and beside her stood a tall, red-haired young lady from a famous chorus. And during the course of the song, she had decided ineptly that everything was very, very sad. She was not only singing, she was weeping, too. Whenever there was a pause in the song, she filled it with gasping, broken sobs, and then took up the lyric again in a quavering soprano. The tears coursed down her cheeks, not freely, however, for when they came into contact with her heavily beaded eyelashes, they assumed an inky color and pursued the rest of their way in a slow black rivulet. A humorous suggestion was made that she sang the notes on her face, whereupon she threw up her hands, sank into a chair, and went off into a deep, vinous sleep. "She had a fight with a man who says he's her husband," explained a girl at my elbow. I looked around. Most of the remaining women were now having fights with men said to be their husbands. Even Jordan's party, the quartet from East Egg, were rent asunder by dissension. One of the men was talking with curious intensity to a young actress, and his wife, after attempting to laugh at the situation in a dignified and indifferent way, broke down entirely and resorted to flank attacks. At intervals she appeared suddenly at his side like an angry diamond and hissed, "You promised," into his ear. The reluctance to go home was not confined to wayward men. The hall was at present occupied by 2 deplorably sober men and their highly indignant wives. The wives were sympathizing with each other in slightly raised voices. "Whenever he sees I'm having a good time, he wants to go home. Never heard of anything so selfish in my life. We're always the first ones to leave. So are we." "Well, we're almost the last tonight," said one of the men sheepishly. "The orchestra left half an hour ago." In spite of the wives' agreement that such malevolence was beyond credibility, the dispute ended in a short struggle as both wives were lifted kicking into the night. As I waited for my hat in the hall, the door of the library opened with Jordan Baker and Gatsby coming out together. He was saying some last words to her, but the eagerness in his manner tightened abruptly into formality as several people approached him to say goodbye. Jordan's party were calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. "I've just heard the most amazing thing," she whispered. "How long were we in there?" "About an hour." "It was simply amazing," she repeated abstractedly. "But I swore I wouldn't tell it, and here I am tantalizing you." She yawned gracefully in my face. "Please come see me. Phone book under the name Mrs. Sigourney Howard. Oh, my aunt." She was hurrying off as she talked. Her brown hand waved a jaunty salute as she melted into her party at the door. Rather ashamed that on my first appearance I had stayed so late, I joined the last of Gatsby's guests who were clustered around him. I wanted to explain that I'd hunted for him early in the evening and to apologize for not having known him in the garden. "Don't mention it," he enjoined me eagerly. "Don't give it another thought, old sport." The familiar expression held no more familiarity than the hand which reassuringly brushed my shoulder. "And don't forget, we're up in the hydroplane tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Then the butler, behind his shoulder, "Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir." "All right. In a minute. Tell them I'll be right there. Good night. Good night. Good night." He smiled, and suddenly there seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he had desired it all the time. "Good night, old sport." Good night. And that's it. More to come later. Good night.